There was something in Perelandra that might overload a human brain.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 4, Perelandra Chapter 3, A Vision of Venus. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack, your favorite C.S. Lewis podcast run by three Thulcandrans, Andrew, David, and myself, Matt. This week, we're once again following the adventures of Elwyn Ransom, who this time is exploring Perelandra. And today, we're diving into Chapter 3 and hear about Ransom's voyage to Venus. Well, gentlemen, it still kind of feels like this is our first time back.
It really is.
We did a common room. Listeners, you guys will have listened to a few episodes so far this season. We recorded those before a huge hiatus, essentially my wedding and honeymoon. And so it's probably been since we've recorded a Perelandra podcast direct episode. 2 months? 3 months? 2.5?
Well, and with David's and my trip to Portland for the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis conference, between our last recording and now, we have met so many more of you in person. We probably met, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 listeners. And so greetings to you all.
That's amazing. And we will say, guys, for the sake of keeping on track with this, if you want to hear a deep dive into the wedding, stories of David, Andrew, and I.
And coding.
In coding, we got a little AI in there.
Ooh, a little.
Go to our YouTube channel. Just go to the most recent Common Room that was released. What would that be, September, David, or is it going out in October?
Yes, it'll be September. So they're going to have to go back in time. Yeah.
Okay. So when you're hearing this, because this is going to be going out much later. So you got to go back in time. I forgot that this is going to be we're recording this September 20th. This is going to be released far later. Yeah, go back in time, listen to it. You'll be able to hear. It was such a joyous celebration. It was so fun. That was the first time Andrew, David, and I were in person together. And we just had one of the most lovely times. We drank some scotch together. Andrew's so good at being intentional. Like, Andrew, you're really good about bringing us together, coordinating us, being like, we need to make sure we get pictures.
He's bossy.
Yeah, he's bossy. He's great. He's like, this is
I am bossy, but we're never going to get a chance at those pictures ever again. And
it was the right kind of bossy in a good sense.
So, and because it was as chaotic as it was, I could pull Matt and go, okay, let's go this way. I also was bossy about getting you a drink, so.
I loved it. I loved it.
Yeah.
We all shared some scotch.
Yep.
It was just a wonderful time. So
the wives were all
go
there.
Listen to that, guys.
Yeah.
We won't spend 30 minutes rehashing it here. But how are you gentlemen doing? How is, since we recorded, maybe give a little snapshot of the highlights. Maybe we just 1 minute round table. David, for people who don't go to the common room, what have you been up to in life? What's the exciting thing either over the last 3 months or the one thing you're looking forward to the next couple months? Andrew, you too. We'll start with David.
Well, my end of the year has been very busy. A lot of traveling. Not only your wedding, Marie and I have been godparents, so we've traveled for that. Obviously, the Portland conference, which was a real blast.
Fantastic.
I've just got back from Chicago. We had our yearly company summit, so I took the train there and back. May never be doing that again.
That wasn't pleasant.
The train on the way there was 3 hours late, so that was a bit of a problem.
Oh boy.
And the weather made the train stop. That's what the conductor said on the way back. It's a little worrying, but okay.
Yeah.
So I've done a lot of traveling. I've got one last bit of traveling to do. The wife and kids are coming with me to Festival Island, where we're going to spend a lovely week in Dingle with my mother. And then we're heading to England to see my sister's family. And the whole thing's going to be 3 weeks. So we're recording now, but we're going to have another break.
Yeah.
And then we'll be hopefully then in a regular recording schedule.
Yeah. Well, bring me back a bottle of that 69 if you can, if you have space.
I'll see what I can do.
All right. I'll certainly pay you for it. For me, the Portland conference was huge, but yeah, there's been a ton of traveling. So went to Matt's wedding, went to Knoxville to see my friend Michael Opisi and baptize his 3 sons. And then, Portland conference. Oh, and Kristen and I did an event for C.S. Lewis Institute in Atlanta for one of their retreats. And we're doing another event for the Lewis Institute. By now it will be past, but it's coming up next weekend at Moody Church. Also, So I showed you all my new flicks. And so listeners, if you can hear this through the microphone, the 3-volume set of J.R.R. Tolkien's collected poems, lovingly and beautifully assembled by Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull. Wonderful Tolkien scholars. So that's one of the treats. Also, I'm committed to putting a book a day. Let's see by the time this comes out if it's still true. But trying to put a book a day on my eBay site. So I've got 3 British first editions up there right now, and I'm going to think I might mix it up with an American Narnia or something.
Real quick, remind people like how would they just Google Andrew Lazo eBay? Or
sure. C.S. Lewis fan at eBay. It's on my social media. It's on my website. And so, yeah. But yeah, C.S. Lewis fan, or if you're looking for C.S. Lewis first editions, you'll probably stumble across there too.
And as a reminder, guys, what's great about Andrew is you're getting a good deal. He sources it for the right price. I remember looking for a first edition myself like 5 or 6 years ago before knowing Andrew. And the dispersion between costs of some of these things are insane. You have no idea what they're really worth.
They've gone ridiculous. I was just looking at some prices of paperbacks in the $300 and $400 range, which is just stupid. But I won't buy a book myself for resale unless I can double my money and still bring it in under anybody else's cost. So part of my goal is I certainly don't mind making some money off of that, but I also want to put a book in somebody's hands who really wants it, really needs it. And I think I'm just one book away. In fact, yeah, I'm one book away from having another complete set of American First Edition Narnias. And I also have the full color collector's edition hardback Narnias from England. So might be time to start thinking about your Christmas shopping. And I do take requests too. So there's my blurb, but having a great time at church and lots of things happening and still thinking and praying about what's next.
Perfect. Well, I have really no update. Everyone knows mine. Wedding, honeymoon, moving in together. That has been driving my life. It's been a joy. It really has been. It's been just so wonderful. So you can hear more about
that. And today's a special day for her as we're recording?
Yeah, you know what? I obviously already partially celebrated with her, but
you made her breakfast?
Happy birthday to Mary, Margaret. We went to a spot that's right next door to us that we love to go to on Friday mornings, and it was just a really lovely, and we did these little oatmeal pancakes that are delicious.
Oh, good.
Well, gentlemen, before we kick off this episode, what are we drinking? I am drinking my classic Celsius mixed drink because we are continuing our Friday morning recordings. So it's either non-alcoholic or a caffeinated beverage.
Ha! Very nicely done.
I'm cracking open a Best Day Brewing Hazy IPA.
Love it.
I have begun intentionally collecting the Global Icon series of Starbucks mugs. And so I'm trying to get ones from every significant place. I've got 3 or 4 from China, several from England. And I just got my Chicago mug because I'll be at the Wade Center a week from today. So I am drinking. Oh, and special thanks to our listener who sent me the coffee. Yeah, I'll see if I can track down that address so I can send you a proper thank you note. But drinking the HEB San Antonio blend in my Starbucks mug. Who are we toasting today?
So today we are toasting Patreon supporter, Elizabeth Schroeder. And in the inspiration, in the vein of this incredible chapter where we just see such a beauty in an unfallen creation, we would just pray that despite this being a fallen creation that we live in, that you are able to see and feel the longing of our Lord and Savior every day as you interact with what is still an incredibly beautiful gift. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Well, it's time for one of my 100-word summaries, this time of Chapter 3. The chapter begins as Lewis shares the various hints offered by Ransom of his indescribable celestial state while traveling to Venus in a casket. Ransom arrives on Venus, splashing down in the seemingly endless ocean. He finds the casket has dissolved and himself swimming, rising up and down the mountainous waves. After enduring a storm, he pulls himself up onto one of the floating islands where he rests and then tries to explore the ever-changing landscape. He discovers some delicious yellow fruit, but chooses not to take another. As darkness falls on Perelandra, Ransom falls into a deep sleep.
Oh, wonderful chapter.
Yeah, and just beautiful prose. It was funny. Yep. Our intern, Julia, she sent me a text message saying that she was keeping pace with our recordings. And she said she just read this chapter. And I said, yeah, in this book, you are going to read the best prose that you'll probably ever read ever.
Yeah, it's wonderfully done, and it's kind of sweeping and majestic. And I think that there's a piece of what he's doing with the prose is trying to represent the situation. And I noticed it especially in this chapter, especially while putting in the notes today, prompted by you, David, of course. Just noticing the theme of the unfallenness of Venus. And now I know that's a bit of a spoiler, but Malacandra is an old world that is unfallen, but Perelandra is unfallen, and the kind of innocence of that is as close as Lewis gets to the heavenly. I think some of the reason why Orwell's prose is choppy is because she is so angry and so deliberately fallen. But the prose here in Perelandra is just remarkable.
Yes, and we will be looking at the poetic nature of this book and the various poetic spin-offs that come from it later this season. But I just want to draw everyone's attention to the prose here and just how gorgeous it is and how it does kind of read like poetry.
Well, and this would be an episode, honestly, particularly this one, but probably this book, where there's just a beauty in reading more of the quotes, the paragraphs, not as much necessarily for the theological truths, even though there's tons of those weaved within here, but just the true beauty of it. Like this book is, out of all of Lewis's book, it's the closest one that I've ever experienced to encountering a longing for beauty through the description of it. He does an incredible job.
Well, and I think that part of that is due certainly to Lewis around this time is reading and writing about Milton's Paradise Lost. And so that's a great tip for writers. If you are a writer, one of the things I like to do as a writer is before I sit down to write good prose, I try to read really good prose. So often, if I'm trying to be clear and concise, I'll read a Lewis essay right before I sit down to write. I think that there's almost a Miltonic majesty that's seeping into Lewis. And I think he may even be, in some ways, attempting to write, maybe not on the level of Milton, but certainly inspired by him.
Well, let's jump in. The chapter begins by Lewis telling us that Ransom never specifically said what it was like to travel by coffin from one planet to another, but just that bits and pieces of it came out obliquely. And 3 examples are given, and this text is not the simplest, and the ideas that it's trying to communicate is not the simplest. So let's look at each of them in turn. The first seems to be set basically at an Inklings meeting. They had been talking about traveling the world, about quote-unquote seeing life. And then one person in the group called B, who is definitely Owen Barfield, talks about him being an anthroposophist. He talks about seeing life in a very different sense, about how the form of life could become visible to the inner eye. That's the quotation. And Ransom seems to have connected this with his time traveling in the coffin. Lewis puts it this way. He says, he even went so far, under extreme pressure, as to say that life appeared to him in that condition as a colored shape. Asked what color, he gave a curious look and could only say, what colors? Yes, what colors? But then he spoiled it all by adding, of course it wasn't color at all, really. I mean, not a weird cool color. And shutting up completely for the rest of the evening. So what did you guys make of this?
You made a comment earlier how there's a little bit of there's a little bit of confusingness here. There's a little bit of teasing out what's being communicated. There's a wisdom in that. I mean, if this is an unfallen world, it shouldn't be like anything we've experienced. We should have seen reflections of it. We should have seen images of it. And so our language should be sort of insufficient. Like, it would almost be bad if our language could sufficiently perfectly describe the ultimate unfallen creation that God intended for us. Like, it'd almost be disappointing a little bit. And so there is just a wisdom communicated in the struggle to communicate this, despite the fact that I actually think Lewis did a brilliant job communicating the uncommunicable or incommunicable.
Yeah.
Whichever way that is.
Matt's linguistic adventures.
Let me just put on my Tolkien hat and create my own language, the uncommunicable.
Woven, not weaved, but who's keeping score?
Yeah, that one too. Well, I'm just trying to create a new language
there you
here.
go.
A derivation.
It's working. I just want to refer to Paul Ford's fantastic book, The Companion to Narnia. Paul helps us to pay attention to different phrases in Lewis because they repeat. One of the phrases that comes up in Magician's Nephew, so the thing that's actually written almost 10 years after Perelandra, but Diggory says, just think of what another world might mean. You might find anything, anything. And Peter, when they get to the country, when they get to the professor's house, says that old chap will let us do anything that we like. And so when you think about this phrase, what another world might mean, you might find anything. And you combine it with our knowledge of what Lewis was interested in. He was interested in space travel, not to keep the typical soap opera drama in a different setting, but to look at the real difference with a capital D. What way might another planet be different? And how might an unfallen planet be different? And it's, I think, apropos that they wouldn't even have language to describe it, a colored shape, right? It's like saying, what does red smell like, or whatever. Now, maybe you say, the cinnamon red hots. But I think he's struggling to fit into earthly language, something that is, well, and we'll find the discussion in the next passage. So he's really playing with the idea of difference here.
When I read this, it seems like the state that he's in when he's in this coffin, it's almost like he's either stepped out of time or stepped out of space. In some way, he's experiencing a transdimensional reality that he's actually able to be separated from life, so to speak, so they can actually see something of it and then try and describe it using the only terms that he can scramble for, in this case, talking about these wonderful colors.
And he's not stepped out of time or space, he's stepped into it, right? He has gone out of the silent planet, and he's now in the much richer universe. And so I think that you also have to contrast the freshness and newness of Perelandra with how jaded and troubled and old we are. So there's, I think, some of that.
Although at this point, he's actually not in Perelandra. He's still traveling through the fields of Arbel.
But even still, he's out. He's free from the translunary, prison of the enemy, of the Bent One.
Kind of like Plato's cave. He's left the cave. He's now seeing the true reality itself.
And we knew from Out of the Silent Planet that the heavens were teeming with life. They weren't space, and there are tinklings of things. And Michael Ward pointed out how important tinkling is, but we'll talk about that another time. It doesn't mean peeing.
Yeah, I was going to say related to stars.
Yes.
Any of you that have toddlers, your mind goes somewhere completely different. Okay, so the second hint concerning Ransom's experience of traveling by coffin comes when a skeptical friend McPhee was arguing against the resurrection of the body. It sounds like this is another Inklings-like meeting that fictional Lewis is attending. And McPhee says, so you think you're going to have guts and palate forever in a world where there'll be no eating, and gentle organs in a world without copulation? Man, you'll have a great time of it. And Ransom responds, oh, don't you see, you ass, that there's a difference between a transsensuous life and a non-sensuous life.
Mm-hmm.
And he argues that the functions and appetites of the body would disappear, not because they were atrophied, but because they were, as it were, engulfed.
Mm-hmm.
And once more, he's searching for language to communicate all this. And he speaks about transsexual, not in the common parlance of today, but something beyond sexual. And so he talks about transsexual with regards to copulation and transgastronomic, although he rejects that term, with regards to food.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say this example is telling us with regards to Ransom's state as he's traveling in this casket?
Well, I think some of it is he's trying to explain to McPhee, who's a skeptic. He's an atheist. He argues against the resurrection. I think in McPhee, who appears in a couple of Lewis's books, in McPhee we find a kind of Kirkpatrick brought back to life, Scottish and skeptical and atheistic. But I think part of what he's doing with this is, again, because we're in another world. Lewis talked about chronological snobbery, thinking that our own age was the best age and everybody else was just benighted and dull. Two, I think that we have this kind of planetary snobbery or I wrote in the notes, humano-sensual snobbery. Why wouldn't we expect there to be different things in different ways than we'd ever conceived if we ever made it to another planet? I mean, again, it's that kind of sense of difference. And so he's trying to, I think, explain to McPhee, don't be an idiot. Of course, things would be really, really different. And they're closer to heaven. And again, it's an unfallen planet. They're out of the bonds of the fallenness of our world.
Here they're talking about heaven, what life would be like in heaven. And it seems that Ransom experienced something of that while he's traveling in the casket.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I really drew out of this is he experienced a different sort of life. maybe something more similar to the life of the angels, because angels are disembodied, but it's not that. It's something that goes beyond that. I think that word engulf, that he's encountering more of life, not less of life.
Right. And angels, I think, is a good comparison, only to say that it's a faulty comparison because angels are not corporeal.
Mm-hmm.
Angels don't share with our Lord or with us what it's like to have a body and to smell and to taste and to feel and the need to do that. And so this human caught up into the heavens is, it's some of Lewis's highest conception, I think.
The third and final example, little tidbit that fictional Lewis gets out of Ransom regarding his coffin life, comes from a rare direct conversation on the subject. Jack says, "Of course, I realize it's all rather too vague for you to put into words." And Ransom, no, he responds very negatively to this. He says, "On the contrary, it is words that are vague. The reason why the thing can't be expressed is it's too definite for language." So, gents, what do we conclude from this?
Well, there's this slipperiness in the modernist approach to language. The linguist Frederick Saussure talks about the difference between the signified and the signifier. So if I hold up a pen, I will say pen, but our French folks would call it a plume, and our Spanish folks would call it a bolígrafo. And, there's lots of different signifiers for one signified. And one of the things in the 20s that happens in modernism is we begin to notice the slippage between language and the thing that it tries to describe. And so that's in some ways some of Lewis's modernist sensibilities sleeping in. One of the modernists says, not language, not in symbol, but the thing itself. And he's trying to describe the thing itself, and he's noting how language is a little slippery. He's also noting that the modernists are really beginning to deconstruct language. And towards the end of his life, he writes this marvelous poem called A Readjustment, about how people won't be able to pick up our signal, understand a story. And he says that that's because devils are unmaking language. And in some of the conversations we have with Weston in chapters to come, you can see how he's really denigrating language. And Lewis and Tolkien, I think, are really involved in trying to rehabilitate the power and purpose of language. And here Ransom is saying language can only do so much, and there are definite realities. But he's certainly speaking kind of about language in a very modernist sense right here.
I did, David, make a note of this and put a star next to it, because this just kind of remind me of the Great Divorce.
Amen.
And just that idea that when you're encountering reality, they use the word definite here, but we really just see that kind of overlap in terms of it's so vivid. It's beyond what we've ever experienced. It's truth. It's objective. It's definite. All a very similar principle. And it's hard to use our language that's been designed for a broken world, to be honest, in a fallen world, to communicate this just like transcendent truth, transcendent beauty. I really loved, he's already setting this up really well. This is very different than Out of the Silent Planet, the segue in. It's very clear from the beginning, there's like minimal threats. He's not quite as worried of threats. That's in part because of his understanding of it. Mm-hmm. It's just very communicating that very quickly he's realizing this is like good, this is true, this is beautiful, this is warm, inviting.
And remember where we set and how Out of the Silent Planet opened up. It's set out in the wilderness, in the dark. The language is really dark and shabby. So is Great Divorce. The language begins with really kind of this gray shabbiness, but in Out of the Silent Planet, it's the vocabulary is incredibly depressing. Here, it's warmer because it's the Inklings, and then it's going to get better and more transcendent still. And the way that Lewis chooses prose and the vocabulary he uses is also expressive of what this novel's about and where he's going.
The one other note I had with regards to this passage on too definite for language, Matt, you mentioned the Great Divorce. I also thought of Plato's theory of the forms. All the things that he's trying to describe are the real realities. Mm-hmm. He's catching a glimpse of that. And, language just limps.
Yeah.
Now, Lewis ends by saying, one thing is certain, that Ransom came back from Venus even more changed than he had come back from Mars. But of course, that may have been because of what happened to him after his landing. And so he then goes on to talk about that landing. And using language that's rather reminiscent of Lewis's own conversion in Surprised by Joy, we're told that Ransom awakes. He awakes from his indescribable celestial state. Thus far in the episode, we were trying to explain what was that indescribable celestial state like, and all we can say is it's sort of beyond language. It's realer than anything else. It's a different kind of life. And as Ransom awakes, this happens as he starts to near Venus, and he starts experiencing the sensation of falling. That sounds kind of terrifying. One side of him is very warm, the other is very cold. There's this intense white light from the planet. It begins to fill the coffin. And then the white light disappears, and the temperature disparity between his left and right, it evens out. And then the predominant color that appears through the casket is coppery. And he's scared. He does actually experience some negative emotions as he enters this rapid free fall that's feet first. Kind of like a runaway elevator or lift falling down the shaft. It's just horrible the more I think about it. But then suddenly there's this great green darkness, an unidentifiable noise, a marked drop in temperature, and then suddenly he's horizontal, and then suddenly somehow moving upwards, and he's now able to move his limbs as the casket seems to be melting. So much like in Out of the Silent Planet, we get all of this from his point of view, his experiences. He's trying to work out what the heck are his senses trying to tell him.
Yeah.
So what actually happens in all of this? What's the third person view?
I want to play a little bit.
It's from chapter 3 of Perelandra and his Ransom's arrival on the planet Venus.
That's Lewis.
He seems to have been awakened, if that's the right word, from his indescribable celestial state by the sensation of falling.
Whoa.
In other words, when he was near enough to Venus to feel Venus as something in the downward direction.
That's a little taste. The rabbit room.
That's cool.
Yeah. The rabbit room has got 3 MP3s. Doug Gresham, his father, Bill Gresham, came to the Kilns after Joy's death in 1960. And Bill Gresham brought a tape recorder. Doug bought a tape. And the rabbit room for $3 has 3 MP3s that you can download total, $3 total for the whole package. And one is that reading from chapter 3. And then one is a reading from That Hideous Strength, the Merlin passage, and then he does the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So yes, a little plug for our friends at the Rabbit Room. I would say Lewis is being, I think, incredibly creative about picturing what that would be like and then portraying it in language. Also, pay attention to the colors. And this chapter is a great support for Michael Ward's theory about the planets. Venus is metal. So each of the medieval planets had a metal associated with it. And the metal associated with Venus was copper, which is why you see copper color everywhere. The reason why you see so much green is that when copper oxidizes, it turns green. And so green and copper are 2 colors associated with Venus because of that metal. So you've got, a great perspective of what's going on when he finally gets captured by the Venusian gravity.
It is really a great book cover, at least the one that I have, to just, because it is really hard to picture this copper and seeing, and they did a good job, like the magnitude of the waves, because we do see these are large. And so your brain can't really wrap yourself around copper sky, copper water. And then when you see it, you're like, whoa, you're like just swimming in golds almost.
We haven't actually got to that bit yet.
Oops.
I've just described what Ransom experiences as he's entering Venus. What is actually happening as he's going through each of those stages?
He's falling. He's come out of the interstellar lack of gravity. He's captured by the gravity of Perelandra, and it's pulling the casket down, and it's a watery world. And so although Ransom can't see it, and we're initially invited to not understand, we don't know what's going on any more than Ransom does, which I think is such a brilliant tactic. We're like, what's going on here? And it's a little panicky. But it's a watery world, and the casket plunges deep into the Perelandrian Sea, and then begins to rush upward and float on the top. So that's kind of what's happening. But we don't see it because we've got it from Ransom's perspective.
We experience it instead.
Yeah.
And that the white light that comes in, that's the sunlight being reflected through the outer atmosphere of Venus.
Right.
It's called the albedo.
Yes.
And when the coffin lands in the water, it starts to dissolve. It starts to disintegrate. And I'm going to argue, both from Lewis's writing, but also the very fact that we are coming to Venus, all this is meant to be reminiscent of a birth.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's through water. It's distressing. There's strange light. There's even a sack which bursts and then sets him free.
Wow, no, that's perfect. I'd never thought about that. So kudos. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense.
Well, Ransom then discovers himself swimming, and in the midst of these great ocean swells, rising and falling on these massive waves. Lewis spends some time really emphasizing, it's like, we talk about waves as big as mountains on Earth. No. This was the real thing.
Yes.
There's an extended period of time while he's in the sea and just trying to make sense of everything that he's seeing. Did anything jump out to you guys?
This was one time where there was maybe a little bit of fear that creeped in a little bit, I sensed, because he's still human as he's encountering this. But it did even really describe the sea, which we typically associate historically with chaos. I mean, if you think of in scripture, if you think of the disciples and the calming of the seas, like tumultuous seas tends to be associated with chaos and fear. And a little bit of that came, but it pretty quickly was like, it described it as a foamless swell of an ocean, fresh and cool after the fierce temperature of heaven, but warm by earthly standards. And so it was like an inviting thing, even though you're in like the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with 40-foot waves towering over you in a ship, but it would feel like it just wasn't that to him. I mean, so again, it's just that warm inviting. There's something different about this creation that despite the foreign nature of the feeling, he was able to kind of just sense that this is a safe space, more or less.
I actually had echoes of the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's different enough, but that's what it put me in mind of, particularly with all of the talk of the golden dome.
Yeah.
And he even describes it as flat gold, like the background of a medieval picture.
Well, and the gold, of course, in Dawn Treader is the metal associated with the sun. And so it's when he's on his back and looking up at the sun that he sees the gold. But there's also that change, that transformation in the water. And it's not salt water, it's sweet water. You can drink it.
Reepicheet would love it.
Yes, he absolutely would. He realizes that he's thirsty after a while. And thirst is an increasingly important theme. You see thirst with Jill. If you are thirsty, you may drink. Right? There is no other stream. And of course, as David pointed out years ago, and has become part of my mental furniture now, the thirst that drives Orwell to her knees and to a vision of the gods. The sensual invitation, even the thirst, is an invitation to spiritual insight, which is part of why when Susan first hears Aslan's name, the narrator says it's as if a lovely sound or a lovely smell had drifted past her. And so the sensual becomes an invitation to understand the spiritual. And that connects, of course, to Malaldil, blessed be he, becoming a sentient being, a sensual being. And so this invitation to the senses, this invitation to thirst, is always an invitation to hunger and thirst for righteousness, to notice that thirst points to something much, much more.
And speaking of food and drink, he talks about feeding upon the sight. He says the water gleamed, the sky burned gold, but all was rich and dim, and his eyes fed upon it, undazzled and unaching. The language of eating and drinking is throughout this. You mentioned when he turned on his back. I love this little section. He says he had somehow turned on his back. He saw the golden roof of that world quivering with a rapid variation of paler lights as a ceiling quivers as the reflected sunlight from the bath water when you step into your bath on a summer morning. I love the echo. And he guessed that this was the reflection of the waves wherein he swam. It is a phenomenon observable 3 days out of 5 in the planet of love. And here's the line. The queen of those seas views herself continually in a celestial mirror. Ugh, so gorgeous.
You know what really got me a little bit before this section was incredible itself too, because this is like the right ordering of pleasure. His drink gave him quite an astonishing pleasure. It was almost like meeting pleasure, and it put a capital P here, itself for the first time.
Mm.
I loved that.
We'll see a mirror come up later on in Perelandra. And so this invitation to see oneself correctly is the kind of spiritual truth, I think, that's being kind of bandied about here. And so much of these first couple of chapters is about correctly perceiving things. There's a connection between the Inkling's argument and then Ransom trying to use his eyes to make sense of what he finds.
And this theme of pleasure, we're going to see this shot right the way through this chapter and beyond. It mentions things several times. It was altogether pleasurable. It is evocative of this Edenic scene, this scene from Eden, from this unfallen world. And when it's talking about these pleasures, we've immediately got to think of the Four Loves, where Lewis spends some time talking about the different kinds of pleasures that we have. Tap water on a hot day, or something a little finer. And just as we leave this section, something strikes Ransom in the face as it whooshes past in the water. He's not quite sure what it is. He thinks maybe it's a mat of weeds, but he's going to find out what that was in a little bit. Because we now double down on this theme of pleasures. In this section, I've entitled it Pleasures Forevermore. Because Lewis tells us that in all the events so far, this assault on Ransom's senses, it actually only lasted for 5 minutes. We've just been getting everything in slow motion. And he's not yet worried about survival as the water is refreshing. He's not tired, and he also trusts the Oyasa that sent him to Venus. This entire next section, we return to this question of pleasure. Lewis describes it as excessive pleasure, which seems somehow to be communicated to Ransom through all his senses at once. I would suggest this is a really key sentence in this chapter. But what the heck does it mean?
Think about Narnia, which is written a few years later, 5 to 10 years later. When the children breathe in the Narnian air, they kind of grow up, they can swim better, they get to be almost adult, and they have this kind of Narnian strength come into them. And so I think being in this atmosphere, Ransom and the Christian part of Ransom is responding to the fact that this is a spiritually perfect or pure world. I think there's some of that. What do you think, Matt?
To be honest, I didn't have a lot of thoughts in this section. I'm an empty vessel.
Well, I think it's worth saying that Lewis says, I use the word excessive because Ransom himself could only describe it by saying that for his first few days on Perelandra, he was haunted, not by a feeling of guilt, but by surprise that he had no such feeling.
Oh, no feeling of guilt. So that reminds us of the end of the last battle. When they get into Aslan's country, Edmund says, notice that you can't feel fear, not even if you try. And so this absence of guilt is exactly what should happen if the world is unfallen.
Yeah, I think it's the fact that we're so used to having feelings of guilt associated with things that are pleasurable because we're usually violating the norms in some way. But the thing is, he's not. He's experiencing greater pleasure and a pure licit pleasure than he's ever experienced before.
And I don't want to jump ahead, so I'll just make one singular comment here. It's like Out of Silent Planet, where we'll see you don't experience too much of it. You experience it fully, to the right order, to the right degree, as you are meant to experience. And then it's complete, which we'll unpack later.
Well, you remember what Screwtape says about God. He describes him as the great hedonist. And that's where I actually pulled basically a Screwtapian quote that's actually quoting scripture, that at the right hand of God are pleasures forevermore. God is not anti-pleasure. It's our twisting of it that is the problem.
Yeah, pleasures are not the problem. The body is not the problem. In Mere Christianity, he says Christianity isn't the anti-body religion. Islam is. The Christianity celebrates the body, and most of the great love poetry in the Western world was written by Christians. So
I actually wouldn't say that, and he doesn't actually say that Islam is anti-body. He's just talking about that with regards to teetotalism.
Sure.
For the anti-body religion, it's actually probably something closer to pagans, because while they celebrate it in life, the point is that they then cast it off in death.
Well, and Stoics as well, right?
And Stoics, obviously, yeah. Whereas Christianity, Islam, and Judaism all believe in the resurrection of the body in some concept.
And that's what I learned from Lewis, is that I learned to look at the body not as that bifurcated enemy, right? The incarnation validates the physical, sensual experience because our Lord chose to participate in having a body. And that elevates our bodily nature. And we see a little of that elevation, I think, in Ransom's experience on Venus.
Now, next up, a storm breaks out, and it's full of lightning. It says, another flash followed, and another. Then the storm was all about him. Enormous purple clouds came driving between him and the golden sky. And with no preliminary drops, a rain such as he had never experienced began to fall. There were no lines in it. The water above him seemed only less continuous than the sea, and he found it difficult to breathe. That sounds horrifying. The flashes were incessant. And this rain, it's not so much raining cats and dogs, but frogs.
Yes.
What on earth is going on here?
Well, according to Pliny the Younger, nothing on earth is going on here, actually. This is Venusian. And according to a quick search of Wikipedia, in certain weather conditions, even frogs, it's rained frogs when a storm comes through and sweeps up the local waters, and frogs, and this is from, immemorial time. But then Lewis occasionally has these weird flights of fancy, the little flying dragons and stuff. And so part of it, I think, is his otherness of Perelandra.
Well, the storm eventually starts to calm down, and Ransom spies some more of that floating stuff that he saw earlier. Matt, what's the floating stuff?
I mean, the short answer is land, if we're trying to use this kind of language. I mean, just first it kind of describes it as like weeds floating, because there's a malleable nature to it. It's like going with the waves. Uses the word island at some point to describe it. But it's large. I mean, at some point he was spending hours to walk inland, although hours is only trekking like 100 yards. But it's a big piece of land.
Well, I don't know if it's land, but it's islands. And I think the islands are made up of this kind of vegetation. And this kind of participates in Lewis's initial vision of, he said, all of my books, he says this before Till We Have Faces, said all of my books began with a picture. And then elsewhere he says, I had a picture of floating islands. And so the form that picture seemed to demand was science fiction. And so the floating islands, this kind of islands that moves, I'm doing my hand up and down, listeners, like you do outside the car when you're driving. The land moves up and down, not the land, but these vegetational islands move up and down and are completely at the whim of the waves. But it's thick and sturdy enough that he can grab on.
And that's what he does. He grabs onto one of them, manages to climb up, and he lies exhausted for some time. But then he starts looking around. But the thing that he sees is that the landscape keeps changing. As the island moves over the waves, valleys suddenly turn into ridges and vice versa, as the land takes the shape of the wave that's beneath it. And so then Ransom, he tries to walk, and it doesn't go particularly great. He just keeps falling over because the landscape keeps changing under his feet. Lewis writes, a blessed relaxation of the strain in which he had been living since his first arrival dissolved into weak laughter. He rolled to and fro on the soft, fragrant surface in a real schoolboy fit of the giggles. And you remember earlier that I said that when Ransom lands in Venus, it's like a birth. Well, what's the next major stage after you've been born? Learning to walk.
Ah, there you go. Yes.
That's good.
And he says it's like it's even harder than learning to walk on a ship, because at least on a ship, the plane remains the same of the entire boat, whereas here everything's changing all over the place. Even the description, I thought of Lucy is learning to walk at the moment, and Lewis writes, he was proud when he could go 5 paces without a fall. Arms outstretched, knees bent in readiness for sudden change of balance, his whole body swaying and tense like that of one who is learning to walk the tightrope. When Lucy's walking, she'll take a few steps and then plop down on her bottom and then usually giggle because she thinks that this is tremendous fun.
Well, and that's Screwtape, which he's writing right around the same time. If their intention is to walk, he is pleased even with their stumbles. And so I never noticed that kind of concurrent echo, but I think that there's got to be at least some kind of link in Lewis's mind right here.
Mm-hmm. And that is also in The Great Divorce, because where MacDonald says the line that he writes in his own works about God being pleased with our first steps, but he was looking for a strong manly gait in the end. And just before we leave this section, I'll point out that pleasure is mentioned again. Lewis says that Ransom might have learned to walk more quickly if his falls hadn't been so soft and enjoyable. If it had not been so pleasant, having fallen, to lie still and gaze at the golden roof and hear the endless soothing noise of the water and breathe in the curiously delightful smell of the herbage. Gorgeous. Well, we've gone from baby's birth to toddler's walking, so what's the next task? Learning to feed yourself. Ransom comes to a wooded part of the island, and the smells create a new kind of hunger and thirst in him. That's a very interesting turn of phrase. It kind of echoes the argument from desire. And he discovers these great globes of yellow fruit clustered like toy balloons. And after accidentally puncturing one of them, he drinks the contents. It was like the discovery of a totally new genus of pleasures, something unheard of among men, out of all reckoning, beyond all covenant. For one draught of this on earth, wars would be fought and nations betrayed.
Dun, 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 dun. Yeah, I want a drink of that. If a listener can do a homebrew of that.
You can get it at the Lagavulin distillery.
I have a friend who's going to Scotland right now, and she's going to try to bring me back some Cull Ela.
I got to say, David, a little bit before that section, one thing that really jumped out to me, because one of the Lewisian themes that I've loved is longing. And he goes, the smells in the forest were beyond all that he had ever conceived. To say that they made him feel hungry and thirsty would be misleading. Almost they created a new kind of hunger and thirst. A longing that seemed to flow over from the body into the soul, which was a heaven to feel. Like that's what creation is meant to do. Truth, beauty, goodness, those are meant to point us towards God. And so in this unfallen creation, when we just enter into the creation, we are drawn up to the Creator, the beauty. And you just see that so well spelled out here. And the beautiful part is in this unfallen creation, or this fallen creation that we live in, we still get that. Maybe to a little bit lesser degree because we haven't been able to experience the creation in the fullness. But like that stuck out to me. I've just always loved the word. It even said so far as a couple of sentences later, breathing had become a kind of ritual. So even like breath itself had become like a ritual. There's a beauty. There's just so much in here. I love it. Lewis did such a good job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shortly after what you mentioned, David, with the wars, there was a number of things here that stuck out to me. This is a section that I love the best. And as he let the empty gourd fall from his hands, and he was about to pluck a second one, it came into his head that he was now neither hungry nor thirsty. And yet to repeat a pleasure so intense and almost so spiritual seemed an obvious thing to do. That's because of his fallen creation. Yet something, and this is skipping a few sentences, yet something seemed opposed to this reason, which was probably formed from his time on earth. It is difficult to suppose that this opposition came from desire, for what desire would turn from so much deliciousness. But for whatever cause, it appeared to him better not to taste again. Perhaps the experience had been so complete that repetition would be vulgarity, would be a vulgarity, like asking to hear the same symphony twice in a day. As he stood pondering over this and wondering how often in his life on earth he had reiterated pleasures not through desire, but in the teeth of desire and in obedience to a spurious rationalism. Like, wow.
Yes. And this is before Spotify. But the idea that you can now get a pleasure anytime you want it, right? I mean, the high school students these days don't know what it's like. I mean, Matt, you probably don't know what it's like to have to wait for cartoons on Saturday morning. And when I was in high school as an NBA fan, there were tape delayed games on Friday night. You never got live NBA and 24-hour cable TV and all the rest. And this idea of honoring a pleasure by treasuring it and letting it be just what it is, and to be, well, as St. Paul says, godliness with contentment is great joy. I think that Lewis has got much to say to us about contentment. It goes back to the phrase that I've said here before, this terrible thing that happened to me at Cambridge, my lectures are poorly attended. It's probably frightfully good for me. And I think back again and again to what Tinidril will say later in the book. Why would I not accept what Mel-Eldil will send to us? Well, he always says it in Out of the Silent Planet too. Why would I not say yes to anything that God would send? If it's death, yes, Lord. And if it's great pleasure, yes, Lord. But who am I to be so selfish, inward focusing, as to try to repeat that again and again and again?
One of the things I think is really dangerous to the spiritual journey in today's society, and it impacts all of us. The youngest generation is probably most at risk because they didn't experience something else, but it's creeping its way up to all of us, is in the last 10 years, the shift to getting everything on demand, what we want, when we want it, how we want it. You use Spotify, TV, that's the same thing. You no longer need to scroll the channels for the right movie. You get food on demand, how you want it with DoorDash, whenever you want it, what type of food. You don't have to cook, you don't have to prep it. We get Amazon on demand, what we want. There's some great things to some of these, but probably the greatest danger is the spiritual journey is honestly about not getting what you want, getting what you should want, obviously, but because of our perverted desires, it tends to be not what we want. And it's like, you have to accept things on God's terms. We don't go around trying to find, as Lewis says, we don't go around trying to find the church that like fits our desires the most. We found the one that's closest to truth and shape our desires to it. Mm-hmm. Truth is meant to shape us to reality, not reality to us. And so much in today's society, it's about shaping reality to our desires.
Yes.
And that's such a backward thing. So maybe the short way of what I'm saying is, spiritual journey is about changing our desires to ultimate reality. And we've spent the economy and economic system and even the political and social fabric of society is the opposite, shaping reality to our desires. And that's a really dangerous thing for the spiritual journey.
And just before we leave this section, I'll just reiterate what Andrew said about this topic has been dealt with before in Out of the Silent Planet. There was an extended discussion over the question of pleasure when begetting young among the Hrossa. Mm-hmm. And we had that line that pleasure is full grown only when it is remembered.
Oh.
I broke Andrew. Go for it, Andrew.
Also, you haven't done that in a while. Also, if this is, and again, spoiler alert, but the book came out in 1943. If you haven't read it by now, it's your own fault.
Yeah, hang on. Right, I want spoilers to be kept to an absolute minimum because some people will be reading along with us. Okay?
Sure. But if this is an unfallen world, and as we have alluded to, Tinidril is kind of an Eve character. The problem is the fruit. And here the solution is the fruit, right? The proper excess. So I think here Lewis is redeeming the mistake of our first mother, right? So yes, fruit as a way to good rather than evil, and a way to satisfaction rather than desire, right? It's this desire for, she looked at it and saw that it was good for eating and able to make her wise. And so what we have here is redemption.
Mm-hmm.
Was that too spoily?
That's okay.
Okay.
That's okay. No more.
All right.
Is there anything you guys wanted to say about the sunset? It's some beautiful prose, but I didn't have a whole lot else to say.
I put but the darkness was warm. Sweet new scents came stealing out of it. The world had no size now. Its boundaries were the length and breadth of his own body, and a little patch of soft fragrance, which made his hammock swaying ever more and more gently. Night covered him like a blanket and kept all loneliness from him. I just thought that was...
Oh, you got to finish it. You got to finish it. The blackness might have been his own room. Sleep came like a fruit which falls into the hand almost before you have touched the stem.
I mean, that was a stunning way to close the chapter. And so, I mean, I'm in awe of his writing. I actually think the more I've gone through this is Lewis's best writing in the sense of beauty. Yep. And communicating it and encountering beauty with, honestly, I mean, there actually are a lot of deep truths woven within this chapter, but even you could take every one of those out and just have the beautiful prose, and you would have encountered some of the greatest truth itself, which is just beauty.
Yes. A couple of features here worth noting. He says, the great fan of color like a peacock's tail, and peacock is Hera, the wife of Zeus. And so there's a mythological reference there.
Also a Christological reference, because the peacock in early Christian art referred to Christ.
Sure, absolutely. There are also these modern analogies all over the place. Oh, I'll give you an example. It behaved rather like a mat of weeds on a river. Or as a ceiling quivers at the reflected sunlight from the bathwater when you step into your bath on a summer morning. This is a thing that Lewis will repeat later. He uses a modern analogy almost always in Narnia when he's trying to calm his readers down. When things get really scary, he'll use a modern analogy. When Caspian's about to go riding off into the haunted woods, he says, and that wallet on the floor is like the school bag that you carry your books in. And so I think he's using these kind of modern analogies to help in some ways kind of orient his reader and assure his reader that everything's okay.
Actually, on that point, I'd actually suggest that it's something slightly different that he's doing.
Okay.
He is doing what George MacDonald did. He is connecting his fantasy world of Perelandra with our own world.
Good.
And so thereby to re-enchant it.
Good.
After I read Perelandra, whenever I had a bath on like Saturday morning and I see the reflections up on the ceiling as the sun bounces off, that's where my mind goes.
Oh, and now I can't help but think of Lewis's bathroom and that big tub and the light coming in, and I can just see that. There's also undulation and troughs, and so that's Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters. And so you've got a couple of the other books that Lewis is writing at the same time. So there are those concepts that come in as well. So, yeah, and that darkness is not frightening. I think he did a masterful job at making that not scary.
It made it sound womb-like.
Yeah.
And that's how he that's how he describes space, the heavens, the womb of worlds.
Oh, that's great. What a great chapter.
Mm-hmm. Anything else, Matt, you'd like to say before we close up?
No, I am just getting so stoked for this book, for the beauty. Well, I hear the call for final drinks. So we want to say thank you to our intern, Julia, and our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah. And thank you to our Patreon supporters, particular top tier ones, Brian and Meg, Rebecca, Sarah, Mark, Kevin, Aldo, Bud 1, Bud 2, Edgar, James, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Shane, Becca K, Paul, Gary, Stephen Kelly, John James, Kate, Peter, David, Angela, Rowdy, and my wife, Mary Margaret.
And a shout out to Shane too. Shane's one of my book buddies on eBay, and so he comments on my stuff, and I think he has his own stuff for sale as well. So cheers to you, Shane. And Mary Margaret needs to get on the tip, man. Do you need a little lesson in financial accountability, Matt?
Her identity was stolen, and
hey, marriage isn't that bad.
Make some more space for her, dude.
The amount of times after like calling and getting it reconciled with her bank, and then the debit cards never worked for like a month and a half. She had to get like a new credit card to do things because it was just a pain in the butt. They were like, everything works, and then every time you'd use it, be denied because of the stolen nature of it. Annoying. Anyways.
Well, I'll bug you about that to get that updated soon. But everyone, please join us again next time
when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.